The highway stretched out endlessly under the Florida sun, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through palmetto scrub and pine forests. Along these roads, travelers moved between cities, businessmen drove to appointments, workers commuted to jobs. The highways represented freedom, mobility, the American dream of the open road. But in the late 1980s, these same highways became hunting grounds for one of America's most unusual serial killers. Between November 1989 and November 1990, 7 men would pick up a woman hitchhiking along Florida's central highways. 7 men who thought they were engaging the services of a prostitute. 7 men who would never return home. Their bodies would be found in wooded areas near the highways, shot multiple times with a .22 caliber handgun. And when police finally arrested the killer, they found themselves face to face with something criminological literature had rarely documented. A female serial killer who hunted strangers for reasons beyond simple profit. Her name was Aileen Wuornos. She would claim she killed in self-defense, that each man had raped or attempted to rape her. Prosecutors would argue she was a cold-blooded killer who murdered for money and personal items. The truth, as always, was far more complex than either narrative suggested. Because to understand what Aileen Wuornos became, you must first understand where she came from. And that beginning was as dark and damaged as anything that came after. This is the story of Aileen Wuornos. This is the story of 7 victims and their families. This is the story of abuse, survival, violence, and the question of whether some people are born evil or whether evil is made. These are the fatal headlines. Part 1. The Making of a Killer. Aileen Carol Pittman entered the world on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, born on Leap Day to parents who had no business raising children. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a psychopathic child molester who would later hang himself in prison while serving time for the kidnapping and rape of a 7-year-old girl. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, was just 16 years old when Aileen was born, already the mother of Aileen's older brother Keith, and completely unprepared for the responsibilities of parenthood. Aileen never met her biological father. Leo and Diane's marriage, if it could be called that, dissolved before Aileen was born. By the time she came into the world, her father was already gone, already on the path that would lead him to prison and eventually to a noose fashioned from his own bedsheets. This absence would haunt Aileen throughout her life, the missing father figure replaced by men who would hurt her, use her, and ultimately become her victims. In January 1960, when Aileen was not yet 4 years old, Diane Wuornos made a decision that would shape the rest of her daughter's life. Unable or unwilling to continue raising her 2 children, she abandoned them at the home of her parents, Mallory and Britta Wuornos, in Rochester, Michigan. Diane simply walked away, leaving her children behind without explanation or promise of return. She would largely disappear from Aileen's life, a ghost mother whose absence left a wound that would never heal. Mallory and Britta Wuornos agreed to raise Aileen and Keith, but they did so under a strange pretense. They did not tell the children they were grandparents. Instead, Mallory and Britta presented themselves as Aileen's mother and father, while the children's biological mother Diane was introduced as their sister. This deception, this fundamental lie about identity and family, created a confusion that Aileen would carry with her always. She grew up not knowing who she really was, not understanding her place in the family structure, believing a lie that everyone around her maintained. The Wuornos household in Rochester was not a happy one. Mallory Wuornos was a strict, domineering man with a violent temper and a drinking problem. He ruled his household with an iron fist, and when that fist was challenged, it often lashed out physically. Both Aileen and Keith experienced regular beatings at Mallory's hands, punishments that went far beyond discipline and crossed into abuse. Aileen would later describe being beaten with belts and straps, being struck across the face, being subjected to rages that left her terrified and scarred. But the physical abuse was only part of the nightmare. Aileen later claimed that the sexual abuse began when she was very young, perpetrated not just by strangers but by family members and people her grandparents trusted. She described being sexually assaulted by her grandfather's friends, being molested by her own brother Keith, being introduced to sex not as something natural and loving, but as something violent and degrading. Whether all these claims were accurate or whether some were the embellished memories of a traumatized mind, one thing was clear: Aileen's childhood was defined by violation and pain. By the time she was 11 years old, Aileen had discovered that she could trade sexual acts for money and goods. She and Keith would perform sexual acts for cigarettes, loose change, whatever the neighborhood boys would offer. For Aileen, this wasn't just about getting money or cigarettes. It was about finding some form of control, some way to get something out of the violations she'd been experiencing for years. If sex was something that was going to be taken from her anyway, she reasoned, she might as well get paid for it. School offered no escape. Aileen attended public schools in Rochester, but she struggled academically and socially. She was known as a troubled child, quick to anger, often getting into fights. Her face bore the scars of childhood accidents and violence, including burns that she claimed came from a fire started by Keith when they were playing with lighter fluid. These scars, combined with her aggressive behavior and poor hygiene, made her a target for bullying. The other children were cruel, and Aileen learned to respond with her fists, developing a reputation as someone not to mess with. But beneath the tough exterior was a girl desperate for love and acceptance. Aileen craved affection, wanted to be wanted, dreamed of a family that would actually care about her. She found brief moments of connection with boys in the neighborhood, believing that sex would lead to love, that if she gave them what they wanted, they would give her what she needed. Of course, they never did. They took what she offered and moved on, leaving her feeling more used and worthless than before. In 1970, when Aileen was 14 years old, she became pregnant. The father was one of her grandfather's friends, a man much older than she was, though accounts vary on exactly who it was and the circumstances of the pregnancy. What's clear is that Aileen, at 14, was carrying a child, and the Wuornos household wanted nothing to do with it. This was a scandal, a shameful thing to be hidden and dealt with quietly. Mallory and Britta sent Aileen to a home for unwed mothers to have the baby away from Rochester, away from prying eyes. On March 23, 1971, Aileen gave birth to a son. She held him briefly, this baby she'd carried for 9 months, this child who might have been her chance at someone to love and be loved by. But she was 15 years old with no resources, no support, no way to care for an infant. The baby was immediately put up for adoption and disappeared into the system. Aileen would never see him again, never know what became of him, never have the chance to be a mother. The loss of her child, combined with everything else she'd endured, seemed to break something fundamental in Aileen. She returned to Rochester angrier, more volatile, more self-destructive than ever. She dropped out of school, unable to focus, unable to see any future for herself. She spent her days drinking, getting high on drugs when she could find them, having sex with anyone who would have her, searching for something she couldn't name and would never find. Then in July 1971, everything changed again. Britta Wuornos, the woman Aileen believed was her mother, died from liver failure, likely caused by years of heavy drinking. Britta had been the softer presence in the household, the one who sometimes showed Aileen small kindnesses, even if she never protected her from Mallory's violence. With Britta gone, the house became even colder, even more unbearable. And it was around this time that Aileen learned the truth she'd been denied her entire life. Someone, perhaps in a moment of anger or perhaps thinking she deserved to know, told her that Mallory and Britta weren't her parents at all. They were her grandparents. The woman she thought was her sister was actually her mother. Everything she'd believed about her identity, her family, her place in the world was a lie. For a young woman already struggling with identity and self-worth, this revelation was devastating. It confirmed what some part of her had always suspected. She didn't belong anywhere. She wasn't wanted. She was the product of a teenage pregnancy, abandoned by her real mother, raised by grandparents who'd lied to her, abused by a grandfather who hated her. The foundation of her world crumbled, and with it went any hope of normalcy or stability. Unable to remain in Laurie's house, Aileen was kicked out in early 1972. At 15 years old, she found herself homeless, living in the woods near Rochester, sleeping in abandoned cars, doing whatever it took to survive. This was when prostitution moved from occasional transactions for cigarettes to a primary means of survival. Aileen began working the truck stops and highways around Rochester, selling her body to strangers for money to buy food, alcohol, drugs, shelter when she could afford it. She would later describe this period as both the worst and the most free time of her life. Worst because of the daily degradation, the violence from Johns, the constant fear and hunger and cold. But free because she answered to no one, because she could go where she wanted, do what she wanted, live by her own rules. The woods became her home, the highways her workplace, the strangers her only companions. In May 1974, Aileen was arrested for the first time for disorderly conduct, drunk and causing a scene in a bar. It was the beginning of a criminal record that would grow longer with each passing year. Drunk and disorderly, driving under the influence, assault, armed robbery, passing bad checks, grand theft auto. The charges accumulated like layers of sediment, each one burying her deeper into a life from which there seemed no escape. But Aileen kept moving, kept surviving. She hitchhiked across the country, working as a prostitute in various states, getting arrested, getting released, moving on. She developed a tough, masculine persona, dressing in men's clothing, drinking heavily, getting into bar fights. She had relationships with men, always turbulent, often violent. They would use her, she would use them, and inevitably things would end badly. In 1976, Aileen hitchhiked to Florida, the state that would become both her home and ultimately her execution chamber. She gravitated toward Daytona Beach, where the highways were busy, the bars were plentiful, and the demand for prostitutes was steady. Florida in the late 70s was a place where someone could disappear, could reinvent themselves, could exist on the margins without too many questions asked. For Aileen, it was perfect. She continued working as a prostitute along the highways and at truck stops, sleeping wherever she could find shelter, drinking to numb the pain and memories that haunted her. She had a few relationships with men during this period, including one that led to a brief, disastrous marriage. In 1976, at the age of 20, Aileen married Louis Gratz-Fell, a wealthy yacht club president in his late 60s. It seemed like it might be her ticket out of poverty and prostitution, a chance at stability and perhaps even respectability. But the marriage was doomed from the start. Louis quickly realized that Aileen was violent, unstable, and unwilling to change her lifestyle. She continued drinking heavily, got into bar fights, and allegedly beat Louis with his own cane during arguments. The marriage lasted less than a year. Louis sought a restraining order and annulment, citing abuse. Aileen was back on the streets. The brief glimpse of a different life closed off forever. The experience seemed to confirm what she already believed. She wasn't meant for normal life, wasn't capable of being loved or being part of a functional relationship, was destined to remain on the margins of society forever. Throughout the late 70s and into the 80s, Aileen's life followed a predictable pattern. She would work as a prostitute, accumulate money, drink it away, get arrested for various crimes, serve short jail sentences, get released, and start the cycle again. She moved between different Florida cities, Daytona Beach, Jacksonville, Ocala, following the highways and the customers they brought. Her criminal record continued to grow. In 1981, she was arrested for armed robbery of a convenience store, for which she served a year in prison. In 1985, she was arrested for grand theft auto. The crimes were sometimes crimes of survival, stealing to eat, forging checks to pay for a motel room. Sometimes they were crimes of impulse, of rage, of the inability to control the anger that burned inside her. But through all of this, through the arrests and the homelessness and the degradation of prostitution, Aileen kept surviving. She was tough, street-smart, capable of incredible endurance. She could sleep in the woods in winter, could face down aggressive Johns, could talk her way out of dangerous situations. She was a survivor, and that survival instinct, that refusal to give up no matter how bad things got, was both her strength and, ultimately, the thing that would lead her to kill. Then, in 1986, everything changed. Aileen met someone who would become the most important person in her life, the one relationship that seemed to offer real love and connection. Her name was Tyria Moore, and she would be both Aileen's salvation and her downfall. Part 2, Tyria and the Beginning. Tyria Moore was 24 years old when she met Aileen Wuornos at a gay bar called Zodiac in Daytona Beach in June 1986. Where Aileen was rough and masculine, Tyria was soft and feminine. Where Aileen was aggressive and volatile, Tyria was passive and compliant. They were opposites in many ways, but they were drawn to each other with an intensity that surprised them both. For Aileen, Tyria represented everything she'd been searching for her entire life. Love, acceptance, a partner who seemed to genuinely care about her. Aileen fell hard and fast, devoting herself to Tyria with a fierce loyalty. She called Tyria her wife, promised to take care of her, to provide for her, to love her forever. And Tyria, for her part, seemed to return these feelings, at least at first. They moved in together quickly, living in cheap motels, occasionally staying with friends, sometimes living in Aileen's beat-up car. Money was always tight, and it was Aileen who provided most of it through prostitution. Tyria worked occasionally, waitressing jobs here and there, but mostly she stayed in the motel room while Aileen went out to work the highways. This dynamic, Aileen as the provider and Tyria as the one being provided for, would define their relationship. Aileen was devoted to Tyria in a way she'd never been devoted to anyone. She would bring her gifts, flowers, jewelry, whatever she could afford or steal. She wanted Tyria to be happy, to have nice things, to feel cared for. And in return, Tyria gave Aileen what she'd always craved: companionship, affection, someone to come home to. For a few years, despite the poverty and instability, they were happy together. But the relationship wasn't entirely healthy. Aileen was possessive and jealous, flying into rages if she thought Tyria was interested in anyone else. She was also increasingly resentful about being the one who had to work as a prostitute while Tyria stayed safe in the motel room. The work was degrading and often dangerous. Johns could be violent, could refuse to pay, could rob her or assault her. And Aileen was getting older, drinking more, finding it harder to attract customers. By 1989, Aileen was 33 years old, worn down by years of hard living. The alcohol had taken its toll, leaving her face puffy and aged beyond her years. The scars from her childhood, combined with the rough life she'd led, made her less appealing to the Johns she relied on for income. She had to work harder, take more risks, accept customers she might have turned down when she was younger. And she was angry. Angry at the Johns who used her body and treated her like trash. Angry at a world that had abused her from childhood and given her no way out. Angry at the unfairness of a life where she had to sell herself just to survive while other people lived comfortable, normal lives. This anger had always been there, simmering beneath the surface, but now it was reaching a boiling point. Tyria was aware of Aileen's anger, her increasingly dark moods, her violent outbursts. They fought more often, usually about money, about Aileen's drinking, about their future together. Tyria occasionally talked about leaving, about getting a real job and a real apartment, but she never followed through. She stayed, dependent on Aileen financially and emotionally, part of the dysfunctional ecosystem they'd created together. In November 1989, Aileen was working her usual stretch of highway near Daytona Beach. hitchhiking and prostituting herself to whoever would pick her up. She'd been drinking heavily, was in a foul mood, needed money for the motel room and for beer. She was carrying a gun, a .22 caliber pistol she'd acquired for protection. The highways could be dangerous for a woman alone, and Aileen had learned to protect herself. And then a man pulled over, a man named Richard Mallory, and everything that came after was set in motion. Part 3. The first victim, Richard Mallory. Richard Mallory was a 51-year-old electronics repair shop owner from Clearwater, Florida. He was a heavy-set man with a mustache, divorced, living alone, with a documented history that included a conviction for rape in another state. But this conviction was not known to investigators at the time of his death, and it would become a point of significant controversy later. On the evening of November 30, 1989, Richard Mallory was driving his 1977 Cadillac Coupe de Ville along Interstate 95 near Daytona Beach. At some point that evening, he picked up a woman who was hitchhiking. That woman was Aileen Wuornos. What exactly happened between Aileen Wuornos and Richard Mallory in the hours that followed remains disputed. Aileen's story, told and retold in various interviews and confessions, was that Mallory picked her up. They agreed on a price for sex and they drove to a secluded wooded area. But once they were alone, Mallory's demeanor changed. According to Aileen, he tied her to the steering wheel of the car, raped her brutally and repeatedly, sodomized her, beat her, and tortured her for hours. Aileen claimed that she managed to get free, grabbed her gun from her bag, and shot Mallory in self-defense. She shot him multiple times as he tried to attack her again. She killed him to save her own life. It was justifiable homicide, she would later insist. She had no choice. The prosecution's version of events was starkly different. They argued that Aileen and Mallory agreed to sex for money, drove to the woods, and at some point, Aileen decided to rob him. Perhaps the sex happened first, perhaps it didn't. But at some point, Aileen pulled out her gun and shot Richard Mallory in cold blood, shooting him multiple times to make sure he was dead, then robbing his body and stealing his car. The physical evidence would later suggest the following. Richard Mallory was shot 4 times with a .22 caliber pistol. The shots hit him in the left arm, the torso, and the chest. The trajectory of the bullets suggested he was trying to flee or defend himself when he was shot. His body was found on December 13, 1989, 2 weeks after he went missing, in a wooded area northwest of Daytona Beach, covered with an old carpet remnant. His Cadillac was found abandoned in a different location, wiped clean of fingerprints. His personal belongings, wallet, cash, were gone. There were no signs of the brutal rape and torture Aileen described, but there also wasn't definitive evidence to disprove her story. The body had been exposed to the elements for 2 weeks. Evidence could have been lost. What we know is this. On that night in late November 1989, Aileen Wuornos killed Richard Mallory. Whether it was self-defense or murder, whether Mallory was a predator who got what he deserved or an innocent customer killed for his money, remains a question that divides people to this day. What's not in dispute is what Aileen did after the killing. She took Mallory's belongings, took his car, and drove back to the motel where Tyria was waiting. She told Tyria that she'd killed a man, that he'd raped her, and she'd shot him in self-defense. Tyria's reaction to this confession would later become crucial to the case. According to Aileen, Tyria was supportive, helped her clean up, helped her dispose of evidence. Aileen abandoned Mallory's Cadillac after a few days, wiping it down to remove fingerprints. She pawned some of his belongings for cash. And then she went back to work, back to the highways, back to prostitution, as if nothing had happened. For a few weeks, life continued as normal. The police found Mallory's body in mid-December, but they had no suspects, no leads, no way to connect the murder to Aileen. The case went unsolved, just another body found in the Florida woods, just another homicide in a state with no shortage of violence. But something had changed in Aileen. She'd killed a man and gotten away with it. She'd taken his money, his car, his belongings, and no one had come for her. The experience had been empowering in a dark way. For once in her life, she'd been the one with the power, the one in control. The man who'd picked her up thinking he could use her body had ended up dead while she walked away free. And if she could do it once, she could do it again. Part 4. The Killing Accelerates. On May 19, 1990, 6 months after the murder of Richard Mallory, a man named David Spears went missing. David was a 43-year-old heavy equipment operator from Winter Garden, Florida. He was driving through the state on business, a long-haul journey that should have been routine. He was a quiet man, reliable, the kind of person who showed up for work on time and took care of his family. His common-law wife reported him missing when he failed to return home as scheduled. On June 1, 1990, David Spears' naked body was found in a wooded area in Citrus County, 40 miles north of Tampa. He'd been shot 6 times with a .22 caliber pistol, the shots clustered in his back and torso. His body had been there for about 2 weeks, decomposing in the Florida heat. His pickup truck was missing, later found abandoned in a different county. The police had no reason yet to connect this murder to the Richard Mallory killing 6 months earlier. Different jurisdictions, different circumstances, no obvious connection. But there were similarities. Both men shot multiple times with a .22, both found in wooded areas off highways, both robbed of their belongings and vehicles. The pattern was there, but no one was seeing it yet. Aileen Wuornos had killed David Spears in the same way she'd killed Richard Mallory. She'd been hitchhiking, he'd picked her up, they'd agreed on a transaction, driven to a secluded area, and then Aileen had pulled her gun and shot him. She took his truck, his money, his belongings. She drove the truck for a while before abandoning it, pawned or sold what she could, and went back to her life with Tyria. The money from these killings never lasted long. Aileen would spend it on motel rooms, on beer and cigarettes, on gifts for Tyria. Within days or weeks, she'd be broke again, back on the highways looking for customers, looking for the next opportunity. On June 6, 1990, just days after David Spears' body was discovered, another man went missing. Charles Carskaddon was a 40-year-old part-time rodeo worker from Missouri who was driving through Florida. He was a tall, lean man with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. He was on his way to visit his family when he disappeared without a trace. Charles Carskaddon's body was found on June 6, 1990, the same day he went missing in Pasco County. He'd been shot 9 times with a .22 caliber pistol, more shots than either Mallory or Spears. The shooting was brutal, excessive, suggesting either panic or rage. His car was found days later, abandoned and stripped of anything valuable. 3 men dead in 7 months, all shot with a .22, all found in wooded areas, all robbed. And still the police hadn't connected the cases. Florida is a big state. Jurisdictions don't always communicate well, and serial killers were usually thought to be male. The idea that these highway murders were being committed by the same person, let alone by a woman, hadn't occurred to investigators yet. But Aileen wasn't stopping. The killing had become easier with each victim, the psychological barrier lowered with each trigger pull, and she needed money constantly. Tyria needed things. They needed the motel room, needed food and alcohol and gas. The killing had become simply another way to survive, another way to take what she needed from a world that had never given her anything. On June 7, 1990, just 1 day after killing Charles Carskaddon, Peter Siems disappeared. Peter was a 65-year-old retired merchant seaman, a devout Christian who did missionary work. He was last seen leaving his home in Jupiter, Florida, driving his 1988 Pontiac Sunbird. He was supposed to visit relatives in Arkansas but never arrived. Peter Siems' body was never found, but witnesses reported seeing his car being driven erratically by 2 women on July 4, 1990, nearly a month after he disappeared. The car crashed, and the two women fled the scene on foot. Multiple witnesses got a good look at them. They described one woman as heavyset with blonde hair, the other as thinner with dark hair. The abandoned Sunbird was processed for evidence, and police found palm prints and fingerprints inside. This was the break in the case, though investigators didn't know it yet. The witnesses had seen the killer and her accomplice. The car had their prints, but without a body, without a definitive crime scene, the Peter Siems case remained a missing person investigation, not a homicide. Aileen and Tyria had been in Peter Siems' car when it crashed. They'd been drinking, driving recklessly, celebrating with the money and credit cards they'd taken from their latest victim. The crash and the witnesses spooked them. They fled into the woods, hitchhiked to safety, and tried to lay low for a while. But Aileen couldn't stop killing. She needed money, and the gun gave her power. By now, she was no longer even pretending these were all cases of self-defense. The killing had become predatory. She was hunting. On July 30, 1990, Troy Burress went missing. Troy was a 50-year-old sausage salesman from Ocala, a friendly man known for his route through Central Florida. He left for work that morning and never came home. His wife reported him missing immediately, knowing something was wrong. Troy Burress' body was found on August 4, 1990, in a wooded area in Marion County. He'd been shot twice with a .22 caliber pistol, once in the torso and once in the back. His delivery truck was found abandoned in a different location, its contents and his wallet missing. 2 months later, on September 11, 1990, Charles Dick Humphreys went missing. Dick was a 56-year-old retired Air Force major and Florida Department of Health and Rehabilitative Services investigator, a respected man who'd served his country and his community. He was married, a grandfather, a man in the twilight of a respectable life. He told his wife he was going to meet someone and would be back soon. He never returned. Dick Humphreys' body was found the next day in Marion County. He'd been shot 7 times with a .22 caliber pistol. The shots clustered in his head and torso. His car was found days later in Suwannee County, over 100 miles away. His badge and his service weapon, a .38 special revolver, were missing, stolen by Aileen as trophies or items to pawn. 6 men dead in less than a year. The bodies were piling up, the pattern becoming impossible to ignore. Police across multiple Florida jurisdictions were finally beginning to connect the cases. All shot with a .22, all found in wooded areas near highways, all robbed, all male. All had picked up a female hitchhiker shortly before disappearing. The police realized they had a serial killer on their hands, and based on witness descriptions and the evidence from the Siems car, they believed the killer was a woman, possibly working with a female accomplice. This was highly unusual. Female serial killers existed, but they usually killed intimates or through poison, not strangers with a gun. This was something different, something criminology textbooks had rarely documented. On November 19, 1990, Walter Gino Antonio went missing. Walter was a 60-year-old truck driver and security guard from Cocoa Beach, a quiet man who worked hard and kept to himself. He left for work and never arrived. His body was found on November 24, 1990, in a wooded area northwest of Cross City. He'd been shot 4 times with a .22 caliber pistol, shot in the back and torso. His car was found miles away, stripped of valuables. Walter Antonio would be Aileen Wuornos' last victim. 7 men in 12 months, 7 lives ended along Florida's highways, 7 families destroyed. The killing spree was over, but the investigation was just beginning. Part 5. The investigation closes in. By late 1990, law enforcement agencies across Florida were coordinating their efforts. It was clear they were dealing with a serial killer, and the evidence pointed to something unprecedented. A female killer hunting male strangers along the highways. The breakthrough came from the Peter Siems case. The witnesses who'd seen the two women flee the crashed Pontiac Sunbird had given detailed descriptions. The car had yielded palm prints and fingerprints. Police distributed composite sketches based on the witness descriptions, and the sketches were shown on local news broadcasts. The composite sketches looked remarkably like Aileen Wuornos and Tyria Moore, though at the time police didn't know their names. The sketches showed one heavier woman with masculine features and blonde hair, and a thinner woman with dark hair. The descriptions matched the two women perfectly. Meanwhile, investigators were tracking items pawned from the victims. Aileen had been pawning stolen goods for cash, and pawn shops were required by law to record identification and thumbprints of anyone pawning items. When police checked pawn shop records for items matching those stolen from the victims, they found multiple transactions under the name Cammy Marsh Green, with thumbprints attached. The pawn shop records were cross-referenced with fingerprint databases, and the thumbprints came back to Aileen Carol Wuornos, a woman with an extensive criminal record. Her photograph and description matched the composite sketches from the Siems car crash. Police finally had a name for their suspect. Further investigation revealed that Aileen had been living with a woman named Tyria Moore. Tyria matched the description of the second woman seen fleeing the Siems car. Police now had both suspects identified, but they needed more evidence, needed a confession, needed to make charges that would stick. On January 9, 1991, police found Aileen Wuornos at a biker bar called The Last Resort in Port Orange, Florida. She was sitting at the bar, drinking beer, looking worn and tired. Undercover officers had been watching her for hours, waiting for the right moment to move in. When uniformed officers approached and asked for her identification, Aileen initially gave a false name. But when they told her they knew who she was, she didn't resist. She was arrested on an outstanding warrant for a weapons violation, a minor charge that gave police the legal justification to hold her while they built their murder case. Aileen was taken into custody calmly. She seemed almost relieved, as if part of her was tired of running, tired of looking over her shoulder, tired of the life she'd been living. She was booked into the Volusia County Jail, where she would remain while police worked to gather enough evidence to charge her with murder. Meanwhile, police were searching for Tyria Moore. Tyria had left Florida weeks earlier, spooked by the composite sketches and the increasing police attention. She'd fled to her family's home in Pennsylvania, hoping to distance herself from Aileen and the killings. On January 10, 1991, police located Tyria in Pennsylvania and brought her in for questioning. Tyria was terrified, convinced she was going to be charged as an accomplice to murder. But investigators offered her a deal: cooperate fully, tell them everything she knew, and help them get a confession from Aileen, and they wouldn't charge her with any crimes. Tyria agreed immediately. She told police that Aileen had confessed to killing multiple men, claiming each time that it was self-defense, that the men had raped or tried to rape her. Tyria said she'd been scared, hadn't known what to do, had stayed with Aileen out of fear and dependency. She claimed she'd never helped with the killings themselves, never been present when the murders occurred, though she'd helped dispose of evidence and benefited from the stolen money and goods. With Tyria's cooperation, police devised a plan. They would have Tyria call Aileen in jail and engage her in conversations that would be recorded. The hope was that Aileen, thinking she was speaking privately with the woman she loved, would confess to the murders on tape. Over several days in January 1991, Tyria made multiple phone calls to Aileen in jail. The conversations were emotional, with Aileen professing her love for Tyria and Tyria playing on that love to extract information. Tyria told Aileen that police were investigating her, that she was scared, that she needed Aileen to tell the truth. And Aileen, desperate to protect Tyria, desperate to save the one person she'd ever loved from legal consequences, began to confess. She told Tyria she'd killed the men, that she'd done it to protect herself, that it was self-defense. She told Tyria not to worry, that she would take all the blame, that Tyria should just say she didn't know anything. The recorded phone calls gave police the evidence they needed. Combined with the physical evidence, the pawn shop records, the witness statements, and Tyria's testimony, they had a strong case. On January 16, 1991, Aileen Wuornos was formally charged with the murder of Richard Mallory. Police held a press conference announcing the charges, and the case became an instant media sensation. A female serial killer who hunted men along highways was unprecedented, and the press descended on the story with fascination and horror. Aileen's face was plastered across newspapers and television screens. She was dubbed the Damsel of Death, the Highway Hooker, and other sensationalistic names. In jail, Aileen was isolated, angry, and feeling betrayed. She'd confessed to protect Tyria, but Tyria had been working with police the whole time. The woman she loved had turned on her. This betrayal, on top of all the other betrayals in her life, seemed to be the final breaking point. But Aileen still had one card to play, her story. And in a series of confessions to police, she would tell that story, painting herself as a victim who'd killed in self-defense, a woman who'd been raped and brutalized and had simply fought back. Part 6. The Confessions. On January 16, 1991, shortly after being formally charged with the murder of Richard Mallory, Aileen Wuornos agreed to speak with investigators. Over the next several days, she would give detailed videotaped confessions to multiple murders, confessions that would be the centerpiece of the prosecution's case against her. Aileen's confessions were remarkable documents, hours of video footage showing a woman who was by turns defiant and vulnerable, angry and remorseful, lucid and rambling. She chain-smoked throughout the interviews, her hands shaking, her face haggard from stress and withdrawal from alcohol. She confessed to killing Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskaddon, Troy Burress, Dick Humphreys, and Walter Antonio. 6 murders. She insisted she knew nothing about Peter Siems, whose body was never found, though the evidence suggested otherwise. For each murder, Aileen's story was essentially the same. She'd been hitchhiking, the man picked her up, they agreed on a price for sex, they drove to a secluded area, and then the man became violent. He raped her or tried to rape her, beat her, threatened her, and she had to shoot him in self-defense. She killed them because they were trying to kill her. She was the victim, not the perpetrator. But the details of her confessions were inconsistent and contradictory. The stories changed depending on when she was telling them and to whom. Sometimes the rapes were brutal and prolonged. Sometimes they were attempts she fought off. Sometimes the men tied her up. Sometimes they just became aggressive. The locations changed. The sequence of events changed. The number of shots fired changed. Investigators noted these inconsistencies but weren't surprised by them. Memory is unreliable, especially under stress, and especially for someone who'd been drinking heavily during these encounters. But the inconsistencies also supported the prosecution's theory that Aileen was lying, that she'd fabricated the self-defense claims to justify murders that were really about robbery. The physical evidence didn't support Aileen's claims of brutal rape and torture. The victims' bodies showed no defensive wounds suggesting prolonged struggles. There was no physical evidence of sexual assault, though that evidence could have degraded given the time the bodies had been exposed. The trajectory of bullets suggested some victims were shot while fleeing or turning away, not while attacking. But here's where the Richard Mallory case gets complicated. After Aileen's trial, it came to light that Richard Mallory had a conviction for rape in Maryland in 1957. He'd served 10 years in prison for brutally rapping a woman. This information was not available to Aileen's defense team during her first trial because it was an old conviction and wasn't discovered in the initial background checks. If Aileen had picked up a man who was a convicted rapist, a man with a documented history of sexual violence, did that make her claim of self-defense more credible? If she'd been raped by this particular man and killed him to stop the assault, was that justifiable homicide? The revelation about Mallory's past created reasonable doubt about at least that first killing, but it came too late to help Aileen's case. For the other victims, there was no such evidence. David Spears, Charles Carskaddon, Troy Burress, Dick Humphreys, Walter Antonio, these were not convicted rapists. They were working men, fathers, husbands in some cases, with no documented history of sexual violence. The prosecution argued that Aileen had killed them in cold blood for their money and possessions, and that she'd only claimed self-defense when she got caught. But there's another possibility that the case raised, one that criminologists and psychologists would debate for years. What if Aileen genuinely believed she was acting in self-defense, even if objectively she wasn't? What if years of abuse and trauma had left her with such a warped perception of male intention that she interpreted normal sexual transactions as threats? What if her paranoia and rage were so deep that she saw danger where none existed? This theory doesn't excuse the murders legally, but it complicates the simple narrative of a cold-blooded killer. Aileen Wuornos was a deeply damaged woman whose entire life had taught her that men were predators and that she had to fight to survive. When placed in vulnerable situations with strange men, situations that replicated the abuse she'd experienced since childhood, did something in her mind snap? Did she kill preemptively, believing she was saving herself from an assault that might not have been coming? We'll never know the full truth of what happened in those woods with those 7 men. We only have Aileen's word, which changed and evolved over time, and the physical evidence, which told its own incomplete story. What we do know is that after her confessions, Aileen was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution was seeking the death penalty, and Aileen, despite confessing, maintained that she'd acted in self-defense and should be freed. She believed, or claimed to believe, that once people heard her story, they would understand that she'd had no choice. She was wrong. Part 7. The trials begin. Aileen Wuornos would face multiple trials for her murders, but the first and most important was the trial for the murder of Richard Mallory. This trial would set the precedent for the others and would determine whether Aileen would live or die. The trial began on January 14, 1992, in the Volusia County Courthouse in DeLand, Florida. The courthouse was packed with media, spectators, and the families of victims. Aileen sat at the defense table looking defiant, wearing jail-issued clothing, her blonde hair pulled back, her face expressionless. The prosecution was led by Assistant State Attorney John Tanner, a seasoned prosecutor who'd handled numerous murder cases. His strategy was simple: portray Aileen as a cold-blooded killer who murdered for money, show the jury her confessions, present the physical evidence, and ask for the death penalty. The defense was led by public defenders who faced an uphill battle. Their client had confessed to the murder on videotape. The physical evidence placed her at the scene. Multiple witnesses could connect her to the victim's stolen property. Their only real strategy was to argue self-defense, to present Aileen as a victim of sexual assault who'd killed to save her own life. The trial opened with the prosecution presenting its case. They showed the jury graphic photos of Richard Mallory's decomposed body, described the 4 bullet wounds that had killed him, presented evidence that his car had been stolen and his belongings pawned by Aileen. They called witnesses who'd seen Aileen with Mallory's property, pawn shop employees who'd taken her fingerprints, forensic experts who testified about the ballistics and the crime scene. Then they played Aileen's videotaped confession. The jury watched Aileen describe picking up Mallory, agreeing to sex for money, driving to a wooded area, and then shooting him when he allegedly became violent and raped her. They heard her describe shooting him multiple times, taking his money and car, and leaving his body in the woods. But they also heard the inconsistencies. In some versions, Mallory tied her up and raped her for hours. In others, he tried to rape her and she fought back immediately. The details didn't line up, and the prosecution hammered this point home. If Aileen were really telling the truth, if this had really been self-defense, wouldn't her story be consistent? The prosecution also presented Tyria Moore as a witness. Tyria testified about her relationship with Aileen, about Aileen's confessions to killing men, about the stolen property that would appear in their motel room. Tyria portrayed herself as a frightened bystander who'd been manipulated by Aileen, who hadn't known about the murders until after they happened. Aileen watched Tyria testify with visible anguish. The woman she loved, the woman she'd confessed to protect, was sitting on the witness stand testifying against her. The betrayal was complete. Aileen would later say that Tyria's testimony was the worst part of the entire trial, worse than the death penalty, worse than anything else. When the defense presented its case, they called Aileen to the stand to testify in her own defense. This was a risky move. Putting a defendant on the stand always is, because it opens them up to cross-examination. But the defense had little choice. Self-defense was their only argument, and only Aileen could testify to what had happened in those woods. Aileen took the stand and told her story. She described her traumatic childhood, the abuse, the rape, the years of prostitution. She described picking up Richard Mallory, agreeing to sex for money, driving to the woods. And then she described the rape, the violence, the terror she felt, and the moment she grabbed her gun and shot him to save her own life. Her testimony was emotional and detailed. She cried, she showed anger, she pleaded with the jury to understand that she'd had no choice. She described Mallory's attack in graphic terms, describing how he'd tied her, raped her, beaten her, told her he was going to kill her. She said she shot him because it was him or her, and she chose to live. But under cross-examination, the prosecution tore her story apart. They pointed out the inconsistencies between her testimony and her earlier confessions. They asked why, if she'd been brutally raped and beaten, there was no physical evidence of this on her body. They asked why she'd taken Mallory's money and car if this was really self-defense. They asked why she hadn't gone to the police if she'd killed in self-defense. Aileen had answers to some of these questions. She said she'd been too scared to go to the police, that as a prostitute with a criminal record, she knew they wouldn't believe her. She said she took the money and car because she needed to survive, because she was broke and homeless. But her answers sounded defensive, unconvincing, and the jury was clearly skeptical. The prosecution also introduced evidence that contradicted Aileen's timeline. Witnesses placed her at bars and pawn shops in the hours after the alleged rape and murder, behaving normally, drinking and socializing, showing no signs of trauma. If she just survived a brutal assault and killed a man in self-defense, would she really go out drinking? The defense tried to introduce evidence of Aileen's traumatic past, arguing that her history of abuse had created a legitimate fear of men that made her perception of threat reasonable. But the judge limited this testimony, ruling that past trauma didn't justify murder unless there was an immediate threat in the moment. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. On January 27, 1992, they returned with a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Aileen showed no emotion when the verdict was read. She sat stone-faced, her hands folded on the table in front of her, staring straight ahead. She'd known this was coming, had perhaps known from the moment of her arrest that this was inevitable, but hearing the words still landed like a blow. The trial then moved to the penalty phase, where the jury would decide whether Aileen should be sentenced to death or to life in prison. The prosecution argued that the murder was heinous, atrocious, and cruel, that it was committed during the course of a felony, and that Aileen had a prior criminal record. All of these were aggravating factors that supported the death penalty. The defense argued for life in prison, presenting evidence of Aileen's traumatic childhood, her mental health issues, her history of abuse. They argued that she deserved mercy, that executing her would be executing a victim, that she'd been damaged by life in ways that should be considered mitigating factors. The jury deliberated and returned with their recommendation: death. On January 30, 1992, Judge Uriel Blount sentenced Aileen Wuornos to death by electrocution for the murder of Richard Mallory. Aileen was transferred to death row at Broward Correctional Institution in Pembroke Pines, Florida, where she would spend the next decade of her life. But her legal journey was far from over. She still faced trials for the other murders, and the state of Florida wanted to make sure that every conviction was secured, every death sentence affirmed. Part 8. More trials, more death sentences. After the Richard Mallory conviction, Aileen Wuornos faced a decision: fight the remaining murder charges or plead guilty. Her attorneys advised her to fight, to make the state prove each case, to preserve her appeal rights. But Aileen was exhausted, bitter, and increasingly erratic. She felt betrayed by everyone: by Tyria, by her attorneys, by the system, by the world. On March 31, 1992, just 2 months after her first trial, Aileen appeared in court for the murders of Troy Burress, Dick Humphreys, and David Spears. Instead of going to trial, she pled no contest to all 3 murders. A no contest plea meant she wasn't admitting guilt but wasn't contesting the charges either. It had the same legal effect as a guilty plea. The judge accepted her pleas and sentenced her to death for each murder. 3 more death sentences added to the one she already had. Aileen was now on death row with 4 death sentences, one of the most condemned prisoners in Florida. In June 1992, Aileen pled guilty to the murder of Charles Carskaddon, another death sentence. In November 1992, she pled guilty to the murder of Walter Antonio, another death sentence. 6 death sentences for 6 murders. The question of Peter Siems remained open. His body was never found, and while evidence strongly suggested Aileen had killed him, the state decided not to pursue charges without a body. Legally, they didn't need to. Aileen was already sentenced to death 6 times over. Additional charges would be redundant. Aileen's decision to plead guilty to most of the murders shocked her defense team. By pleading guilty, she was waiving her right to trial, waiving her ability to present a defense, making appeals much more difficult. But Aileen didn't care about appeals. She was angry, self-destructive, ready for it all to be over. In court statements during her guilty pleas, Aileen continued to insist that she'd killed in self-defense, that the men had raped or tried to rape her, that she was a victim being executed for defending herself. She railed against the system, against men, against the unfairness of her situation. She was defiant to the end, refusing to show remorse, refusing to play the role of the repentant criminal. Her statements were rambling and sometimes incoherent, filled with anger and bitterness. She talked about how society had failed her from childhood, how she'd been abused and raped and forced into prostitution, how the men she killed were predators who got what they deserved. She positioned herself as a vigilante, a woman who'd fought back against male violence, and she seemed genuinely bewildered that people didn't see it that way. The judges and prosecutors were unmoved. Whatever Aileen's past trauma, whatever abuse she'd suffered, she'd murdered at least 6 men, possibly 7. She'd shot them multiple times, robbed them, left their bodies in the woods for animals to scavenge. The crimes were brutal and calculated, not the panicked actions of a woman defending herself. By the end of 1992, Aileen Wuornos had 6 death sentences and was housed on death row, where she would remain for the next decade. Her execution wasn't immediate. Death penalty cases go through lengthy appeals processes, but her fate seemed sealed. Part 9. Life on Death Row. Aileen Wuornos spent 10 years on death row at Broward Correctional Institution in Pembroke Pines, Florida. Death row was exactly what it sounds like: a place where condemned prisoners wait for their executions, living in small cells with minimal human contact. their days filled with nothing but time and regret, and the knowledge that someday the state will kill them. For Aileen, death row was both a punishment and a strange kind of refuge. She was safe from the dangers of the streets, safe from abusive men, safe from the daily struggle for survival that had defined her entire life. She had a cell, regular meals, access to books and writing materials. In a perverse way, she had more stability on death row than she'd ever had in her life. But the isolation was crushing. Death row prisoners are kept separate from the general population, confined to their cells for 23 hours a day, with 1 hour for exercise in a small yard. Human contact is minimal conversations shouted between cells, brief interactions with guards, occasional visits from lawyers or clergy. Aileen struggled with this isolation. She'd always been someone who needed connection, who craved love and affection even as she pushed people away with her aggression and volatility. On death row, there was no one to connect with. No Tyria to come home to, no companionship of any kind. She filled her time reading, writing letters, and giving interviews. Aileen became something of a media phenomenon, one of the most well-known female serial killers in American history. Documentaries were made about her case. Books were written. Journalists requested interviews, which she sometimes granted and sometimes refused depending on her mood. Her interviews from death row show a woman who was increasingly unstable, her mental health deteriorating with each passing year. Sometimes she maintained her story of self-defense, insisting she'd killed rapists who deserved to die. Other times she seemed to embrace the role of monster, saying she'd kill again if given the chance, that she hated men and was glad they were dead. In 1992, filmmaker Nick Broomfield released a documentary about Aileen called Aileen Wuornos, The Selling of a Serial Killer. The documentary was critical of the people who'd profited from Aileen's story, her lawyer, her adoptive mother who sold story rights to Hollywood, the police who'd used Tyria to extract confessions. Broomfield portrayed Aileen as someone who'd been exploited her entire life and was still being exploited even on death row. The documentary brought renewed attention to Aileen's case and raised questions about whether she'd received adequate legal representation, whether her confessions had been coerced, whether the death penalty was appropriate for someone with her history of trauma and abuse. But it didn't change her legal situation. She was still on death row, still condemned to die. Aileen's appeals moved through the courts slowly. Her lawyers argued that her confessions had been coerced, that she'd been mentally incompetent when she pled guilty, that her traumatic past should have been considered a mitigating factor in sentencing, that the revelation about Richard Mallory's rape conviction created reasonable doubt. But court after court rejected these arguments, upholding her convictions and death sentences. The revelation about Richard Mallory's past as a convicted rapist did lead to some legal action. In 1994, Aileen was granted a new trial for the Mallory murder based on the argument that the prosecution had withheld exculpatory evidence about Mallory's history. But before the trial could happen, the Florida Supreme Court reversed the decision, ruling that Mallory's past conviction was not necessarily relevant to whether Aileen had acted in self-defense in this specific instance. This ruling was controversial. Many people felt that if Aileen had known she was getting into a car with a convicted rapist, it would have influenced how threatened she felt, how she interpreted his actions, whether her fear was reasonable. But the courts disagreed and the conviction stood. As the years passed, Aileen seemed to give up on the appeals process. She fired her lawyers, refused to cooperate with efforts to overturn her sentences, and began actively requesting that the state execute her. She was tired, she said, tired of the appeals, tired of the waiting, tired of living in a cage. She wanted it to be over. In 2001, Nick Broomfield returned to interview Aileen for a second documentary, Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer. The interview showed a woman who was clearly deteriorating mentally, paranoid and delusional, claiming the prison staff were torturing her with sonic waves, that the police had framed her, that a conspiracy was working to keep her in prison. She seemed to have lost touch with reality, her mental state fragile and fracturing. Mental health experts who examined Aileen during this period diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and possible brain damage from years of alcohol abuse and physical trauma. Some argued she was not mentally competent to be executed, that her request to die was not a rational decision, but the product of mental illness and despair. But the courts ruled she was competent. She understood she was going to die, understood that the execution would kill her, and had made a conscious choice to stop fighting. That was enough, legally, to proceed with the execution. Part 10. The Execution. On October 9, 2002, Florida Governor Jeb Bush signed Aileen Wuornos' death warrant, setting her execution for October 9, 2002. Aileen would die by lethal injection, Florida having switched from electrocution to this method in 2000. In the final weeks before her execution, Aileen gave her last interviews. She seemed calm, almost relieved that the waiting was over. She maintained that she'd killed in self-defense, but also said she was ready to die, that she wanted it to be over, that she'd made peace with her fate. She was asked about remorse, about whether she felt sorry for the families of her victims. Her answer was complicated. She said she was sorry for their loss, but maintained that the men she killed were not innocent, that they'd tried to hurt her, that she'd done what she had to do to survive. She seemed unable or unwilling to see the pain she'd caused, the lives she'd destroyed beyond her own. Aileen spent her last day writing letters and speaking with spiritual advisors. She'd had a complicated relationship with religion throughout her life, sometimes embracing it as a source of comfort, other times rejecting it as another form of control and hypocrisy. In the end, she seemed to find some solace in the idea of an afterlife, in the belief that she might find peace in death that had eluded her in life. On the morning of October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was taken from her cell and led to the execution chamber at Florida State Prison in Stark. She was 56 years old, though she looked much older, the years of hard living etched into every line of her face. The execution chamber was a small room with a gurney in the center, surrounded by windows through which witnesses could observe. The witnesses included family members of her victims, law enforcement officials, media representatives, and Aileen's lawyer. Tyria Moore was not present. She disappeared from public view years earlier, reportedly living quietly under a different name, trying to escape the shadow of Aileen Wuornos. Aileen was strapped to the gurney, IV lines inserted into her arms to deliver the lethal drugs. She was asked if she had any last words. Her final statement was brief and bizarre, referencing the movie Monster which had been made about her life. "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." The statement was quintessentially Aileen, defiant, strange, disconnected from conventional sentiment. There was no apology, no expression of remorse, no final moment of humanity that might have brought closure to the families watching, just a rambling reference to a science fiction movie and a promise to return. At 9:47 a.m., the lethal injection began. The first drug, sodium pentothal, rendered her unconscious. The second drug, pancuronium bromide, paralyzed her respiratory system. The third drug, potassium chloride, stopped her heart. Aileen Wuornos was pronounced dead at 9:47 a.m. on October 9, 2002. Her death ended one of the most unusual cases in American criminal history. A female serial killer who hunted male strangers, who claimed self-defense while prosecutors claimed cold-blooded murder, whose traumatic past raised questions about culpability and free will that the courts never adequately answered. Part 11. The Victims RMBRED. In all the attention paid to Aileen Wuornos, the trials, the documentaries, the debates about whether she was a victim or a monster, it's easy to forget the 7 men whose lives she ended. These were real people with families, friends, lives full of complexity and value. They deserve to be remembered not just as victims in a serial killer's tally, but as individuals who mattered. Richard Mallory was 51 years old when he died. He owned an electronics repair shop in Clearwater, Florida, a small business he'd built through hard work and technical skill. He was divorced, lived alone, and yes, he had a conviction for rape from decades earlier, a dark spot on his past. But he'd served his time, lived the rest of his life without further violent incidents, and was by most accounts a quiet, solitary man. He didn't deserve to be shot 4 times and left in the woods to decompose. His family mourned him. His death left a hole that was never filled. David Spears was 43 years old, a heavy equipment operator from Winter Garden. He was in a long-term relationship, had children, was known as a reliable worker and a decent man. He was driving through Florida on a work trip when he picked up a hitchhiker, a decision that cost him his life. He was shot 6 times, his body left in Citrus County for the animals to find. His common-law wife waited for him to come home, and when he didn't, she knew something terrible had happened. The family he left behind had to live with the knowledge that his last moments were filled with terror and pain. Charles Carskaddon was 40 years old, a part-time rodeo worker from Missouri. He was tall and lean, weathered from years of outdoor work, on his way to visit family when he disappeared. He was shot 9 times, more bullets than any of the other victims, suggesting either panic or rage on Aileen's part. His family never got to say goodbye, never got to see him one last time. They were left with questions that would never be answered and a grief that would never fully heal. Peter Siems was 65 years old, a retired merchant seaman who'd found purpose in missionary work and helping others. He was a devout Christian, someone who believed in the goodness of people, who tried to live his faith through service. He was last seen driving toward Arkansas to visit relatives, a trip he'd made many times before. His body was never found, which means his family never got to lay him to rest properly, never got the closure that comes with a funeral and a grave. To this day, Peter Siems' final resting place remains unknown. Troy Burress was 50 years old, a sausage salesman from Ocala who drove his route through central Florida every day, known and liked by the people he served. He had a wife who loved him, a routine life that gave him satisfaction. He left for work one morning in July 1990 and never came home. He was shot twice, his body left in the woods, his delivery truck abandoned miles away. His wife had to live with the knowledge that he died alone, scared, at the hands of a stranger he tried to help. Dick Humphreys was 56 years old, a retired Air Force major and Florida Department of Health and Rehabilitative Services investigator. He'd served his country in the military, then served his community as a public servant working to protect vulnerable people. He was married, a grandfather, someone who'd built a life of honor and service. He was shot 7 times in the head and torso, killed with a brutality that seemed especially cruel given his life of helping others. His family lost not just a father and husband but a role model, someone whose life had stood for something meaningful. Walter Antonio was 60 years old, a truck driver and security guard from Cocoa Beach. He was a quiet man who worked hard, kept to himself, lived a simple life. He was shot 4 times, his body left northwest of Cross City, his car found stripped miles away. He was the last victim, killed in November 1990, the end of Aileen's year-long killing spree. His death, like the others, left family members grieving, asking why, struggling to understand how someone they loved could be taken so suddenly and violently. These 7 men came from different backgrounds, different ages, different life circumstances. But they shared certain things. They were all alone when they died, all killed by someone they'd shown kindness to by offering a ride, all left in wooded areas for strangers to find. Their families all faced the same nightmare of waiting for news, of hopping against hope, of finally receiving confirmation that their loved one was gone. The families of Aileen's victims had to endure not just the loss but the media circus that followed. Their loved ones' deaths became entertainment, the subject of documentaries and movies and endless speculation. They had to hear Aileen claim that the men deserved to die, that they were rapists who got what was coming to them. They had to watch as some people, particularly some feminist activists, portrayed Aileen as a victim fighting back against male violence, as if these 7 men were representative of all male predators rather than individuals who deserved to be judged on their own merits. Some of the families attended Aileen's trials, sat in the courtroom day after day, listened to the evidence, heard the confessions. They wanted justice, wanted to see the person who'd killed their loved one held accountable. And when Aileen was sentenced to death, many of them felt that justice had been served, that the punishment fit the crime. Others struggled with the death penalty, uncomfortable with state-sanctioned killing even of someone who'd killed their family member. The question of whether executing Aileen brought any real closure or healing is one that different family members answered differently. When Aileen was executed in 2002, some family members were present to witness it. They watched as the woman who'd killed their loved ones was strapped to a gurney and injected with lethal drugs. They watched her die, and perhaps for some, that brought a sense of completion, of the final chapter being written. For others, it was just another painful moment in a long series of painful moments, the end of Aileen's life doing nothing to bring back the lives she'd taken. In the years since the executions, the families have largely retreated from public view, trying to live their lives without the constant reminder of their loss. But the absence of their loved ones remains, a permanent hole in the fabric of their families. These 7 men deserve to be remembered not as statistics in a true crime story but as people. Fathers, sons, brothers, husbands, friends. Men with dreams and disappointments, successes and failures, lives that mattered to the people who loved them. Aileen Wuornos took those lives, and nothing can give them back. Part 12. The Cultural Impact and Psychological Analysis. The case of Aileen Wuornos occupies a unique place in American criminal history and popular culture. She was not the first female serial killer. That distinction belongs to others, depending on how you define serial killing, but she was arguably the most famous, and certainly the most studied and discussed. Female serial killers exist, but they're relatively rare compared to male serial killers, and they typically follow different patterns. Female serial killers tend to kill people they know, family members, patients if they're nurses, people in their care. They tend to use poison or other methods that don't require physical strength or confrontation. They tend to kill for profit or because of mental illness, not for sexual gratification or power. Aileen broke this mold. She killed strangers. She used a gun. She hunted along highways like male serial killers do. Her victims were men she'd lured into vulnerable positions. In these ways, she killed like a man, not like the typical female serial killer profile. This raised fascinating questions for criminologists and psychologists. What made Aileen different from other female serial killers? Was it her traumatic past that masculinized her psychology? Was it the years of living on the streets, of having to be physically tough to survive? Was it something innate, some quality of her personality or brain chemistry that predisposed her to this particular kind of violence? Dr. Phyllis Chesler, a feminist psychologist who studied Aileen's case, argued that Aileen was the product of a patriarchal society that abused women and then punished them when they fought back. In this interpretation, Aileen was a victim of child sexual abuse, incest, prostitution, and male violence who finally snapped and killed her oppressors. The fact that she was executed, while male serial killers who killed women were often portrayed sympathetically in media, was, In this view, evidence of a double standard. Other feminists disagreed with this interpretation, arguing that claiming Aileen as a symbol of feminist resistance was both factually wrong and morally problematic. The men she killed weren't necessarily rapists or abusers. Some of them were just ordinary men who made the mistake of picking up the wrong hitchhiker. Using their deaths to make a political point about male violence seemed disrespectful to their memories and to their families. From a psychological perspective, Aileen clearly suffered from severe mental health issues. Multiple psychiatric evaluations diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder, characterized by unstable relationships, fear of abandonment, extreme emotional reactions, and impulsive behavior. She also showed signs of antisocial personality disorder, with a pattern of disregard for others' rights, lack of empathy, and repeated criminal behavior. But diagnosis doesn't equal explanation. Lots of people have borderline personality disorder or antisocial personality disorder and don't become serial killers. What was it about Aileen specifically that led her down this path? The answer seems to lie in the intersection of her traumatic childhood, her years of victimization, her chronic homelessness and poverty, her substance abuse, and her particular psychological makeup. Each factor alone wouldn't have been enough, but combined, they created a perfect storm. The childhood sexual abuse taught Aileen that her body was something to be used and violated, that sex was inherently violent and degrading. The abandonment by her mother and the abuse by her grandfather taught her that she couldn't trust anyone, that the world was fundamentally hostile. The years of prostitution reinforced these lessons daily, putting her in situations where she was vulnerable to male violence. Her relationship with Tyria gave her something to live for but also created pressure to provide financially, pressure that may have pushed her toward increasingly desperate measures. Her alcoholism impaired her judgment and lowered her inhibitions, making it easier to pull the trigger. Her possession of a gun gave her the means. And perhaps most importantly, her accumulation of rage at her childhood abusers, at the Johns who used her, at a society that had marginalized her, at the fundamental unfairness of her life created the motive. Each man who picked her up represented, in some way, all the men who'd hurt her. Shooting them was shooting her grandfather, her brother, the rapists and Johns and men who'd used her body and thrown her away. This doesn't justify the murders. Understanding isn't excusing, but it helps explain how someone becomes capable of killing 7 people over the course of a year without apparent remorse. The question of whether Aileen killed in self-defense is one that divides people to this day. The legal system concluded she didn't, that her claims of rape and assault were fabricated to justify murders committed for profit. But some researchers and advocates believe at least some of her victims may have been violent toward her, that her fear may have been based in reality even if her response was disproportionate. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Richard Mallory, with his history of sexual violence, may well have assaulted Aileen. Her killing of him may have been legitimately defensive, a woman fighting off a rapist. But once she'd killed him and gotten away with it, once she'd experienced the power of shooting someone who threatened her, the threshold for feeling threatened may have lowered. Perhaps some of the later victims did make aggressive moves toward her. Perhaps some didn't, but Aileen interpreted normal behavior as threatening because of her trauma and paranoia. Perhaps some she killed in cold blood for their money, inventing the rape claims afterward. We'll never know for certain because the only living witness was Aileen, and her story changed depending on when and to whom she was telling it. What we do know is that by the end, Aileen had become what she'd always feared, a predator. She was hunting men along the highways, carrying a gun, prepared to kill. Whether she believed she was acting defensively or whether she'd embraced the role of killer, the result was the same. 7 men dead, 7 families grieving, and Aileen herself on a path that could only end in prison or death. The case also raised questions about the death penalty and whether it should apply to someone with Aileen's background. Opponents of capital punishment pointed to her history of severe child abuse, her mental illness, her obvious psychological damage. How could society execute someone who'd been victimized so brutally from childhood? Wasn't there some responsibility to recognize that she was damaged, not evil? Supporters of the death penalty responded that personal history doesn't erase responsibility for murder. Lots of people suffer childhood abuse and don't become serial killers. Aileen made choices, pulled the trigger 7 times, ended 7 lives. She needed to be held accountable for those choices, regardless of what made her the person she was. The debate continues. Aileen's execution didn't settle it, just as no single case ever settles these larger questions about justice and punishment and the nature of evil. Part 13. The Aftermath and Legacy. In the years following Aileen Wuornos' execution, her case continued to generate interest and debate. In 2003, the film Monster was released, with Charlize Theron portraying Aileen in a performance that would win her an Academy Award for Best Actress. The film took a sympathetic view of Aileen, portraying her as a damaged woman driven to kill by desperation and abuse. Monster was both praised and criticized for its portrayal. Some felt it humanized Aileen and helped people understand the complexity of her case. Others felt it romanticized a serial killer and was disrespectful to the victims and their families. The film certainly brought renewed attention to the case and introduced Aileen's story to a generation that hadn't followed the original trials. Charlize Theron's transformation for the role was remarkable. She gained weight, wore prosthetic teeth, adopted Aileen's mannerisms and speech patterns. The performance captured both Aileen's vulnerability and her capacity for violence, the damaged child and the killer she became. It was a nuanced portrayal that resisted easy judgment, presenting Aileen as neither pure victim nor pure monster but something more complicated. The film's portrayal of Tyria Moore was less flattering. She was shown as passive and complicit, enjoying the money and goods from Aileen's crimes while maintaining plausible deniability. Whether this was fair to the real Tyria Moore is debatable, but it reflected many people's view that Tyria had used Aileen and then betrayed her when it was convenient. The real Tyria Moore has never spoken publicly about the case beyond her testimony at trial and her cooperation with police. She reportedly changed her name and tried to build a life far from the shadow of Aileen Wuornos. Whether she feels guilt for her role in Aileen's downfall, whether she mourns the woman she once loved, whether she thinks about the 7 dead men, we don't know. She chose silence, and perhaps that's her right. Nick Broomfield's 2 documentaries, Aileen Wuornos, The Selling of a Serial Killer, and Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer, presented a different view than Monster. Broomfield was critical of everyone involved in Aileen's case: her lawyer who seemed more interested in media attention than defending her, her adoptive mother who sold movie rights, the police who used Tyria as bait, the media that sensationalized her crimes. Broomfield's documentaries argued that Aileen was failed by everyone who was supposed to help her, from her family in childhood to her lawyers in adulthood. His interviews with Aileen on death row showed a woman clearly deteriorating mentally, and he questioned whether she was competent to be executed. His work raised important questions about the death penalty and mental illness, about exploitation and the criminal justice system. In academia, Aileen's case became a subject of study in criminology, psychology, gender studies, and sociology courses. She was an outlier, a data point that didn't fit the models, and therefore fascinating to researchers trying to understand the full spectrum of criminal behavior. Some researchers focused on her as an example of how childhood trauma can create violent adults, studying the direct line from her abuse to her crimes. Others examined her through a gender lens, asking what it means that society was more horrified by a female serial killer than by the many male serial killers who'd killed far more victims. Still others looked at her case as an example of how mental illness intersects with the criminal justice system, particularly for women. The case also became part of the ongoing debate about prostitution and sex work. Advocates for decriminalizing prostitution pointed to Aileen as an example of how criminalizing sex work makes it more dangerous for the workers, forcing them into situations where they're vulnerable to violence with no legal recourse. If prostitution were legal and regulated, they argued, Aileen might have had safer working conditions, might have been able to report violence without fear of arrest, might not have felt the need to carry a gun. Others disagreed, arguing that Aileen's crimes had nothing to do with the legal status of prostitution and everything to do with her individual pathology. Making prostitution legal wouldn't have changed the fact that she was a damaged, violent person who killed for money, and possibly for psychological reasons having nothing to do with self-defense. For the families of the victims, the continued attention on Aileen was often painful. Every documentary, every movie, every article was a reminder of their loss. They had to watch as Aileen was portrayed sympathetically in some media, as if she were the real victim. They had to hear people debate whether the men they loved deserved to die. The wounds never fully healed because the case never fully faded from public consciousness. Some family members spoke out over the years, trying to remind people that their loved ones were human beings who deserved to be remembered with respect. They argued against the tendency to focus solely on Aileen while forgetting the 7 men she killed. They wanted justice not just in the form of legal punishment, but in the form of memory, of their family members being honored as more than just names on a victim list. The location where some of the murders occurred became, in a macabre way, part of true crime tourism. People interested in serial killers would visit the wooded areas where bodies were found, the bars where Aileen was arrested, the courthouse where she was tried. This kind of dark tourism is common for famous cases, but it's deeply disturbing to the families who have to live in these communities and be reminded constantly of their loss. Florida, for its part, moved on from the case. Aileen Wuornos was one of many violent criminals the state had prosecuted and executed. The highways where she killed continued to be traveled by thousands of people daily, most of whom had no idea what had happened along these roads. Life continued, as it always does, the past becoming history, the victims becoming memories. But for those directly affected, the families of the 7 men, the police who worked the case, the lawyers who prosecuted and defended her, the people who knew Aileen or her victims, the case remained vivid and painful. You don't forget being part of something like this. You carry it with you. Part 14. Final Aria Felicitaciones. The story of Aileen Wuornos raises questions that have no easy answers. Questions about justice and mercy, about nature and nurture, about how much we can blame someone's past for their present actions, about whether some people are beyond redemption. If you'd met Aileen as a child, before the abuse became unbearable, before prostitution became her only means of survival, before alcohol and rage took over her life, would you have seen the seeds of a serial killer? Or would you have seen a damaged little girl who desperately needed help? If intervention had come early enough, if her mother hadn't abandoned her, if her grandfather hadn't beaten her, if she'd been removed from that abusive home and placed somewhere safe, if she'd received therapy and support and love, could Aileen have become someone different? Could she have lived a normal life, held a job, formed healthy relationships, died of old age having never hurt anyone? We can't know the answer to that hypothetical. What we know is that no intervention came. Aileen fell through every crack in the system, was failed by family and community and institutions that might have saved her. By the time she was a teenager, the damage was done. By the time she was an adult, the pattern was set. And by the time she killed Richard Mallory in 1989, she'd become something dangerous. Does understanding how she became that person mean we excuse what she did? No. Understanding and excusing are not the same thing. We can acknowledge that Aileen was victimized while also acknowledging that she victimized others. We can feel sympathy for the abused child she was while condemning the killer she became. Human beings are capable of holding these complexities, of recognizing that someone can be both a victim and a perpetrator, that suffering doesn't justify causing suffering to others. The men Aileen killed were not abstract symbols of male violence. They were individuals who made the mistake of showing kindness to a stranger by offering her a ride. Some may have intended to hire her for sex, which is a transaction that both parties apparently agreed to. We don't know if any of them became violent toward her. We have only Aileen's word, and her word changed depending on when she was speaking and what she wanted people to believe. What we know for certain is that 7 men ended up dead, shot multiple times with a .22 caliber pistol, their bodies left in the woods, their belongings stolen. Whatever threat they may or may not have posed, the response was disproportionate and illegal. You don't get to shoot someone multiple times, rob them, and leave them to decompose, and then claim self-defense without substantial evidence to support that claim. The legal system concluded that Aileen was guilty of murder, not of justifiable homicide. 6 juries or judges came to this conclusion. The evidence supported it. And while we can question whether the death penalty was the appropriate punishment, we can't reasonably question that she killed those men deliberately and unlawfully. At the same time, we can question whether a system that allowed Aileen to be so thoroughly abused and neglected as a child bears some responsibility for what she became. We can question whether executing her brought any real justice, or whether it was simply revenge dressed up in legal language. We can question whether more compassion and fewer death sentences might create a better society. These are the debates that Aileen's case continues to provoke, and they're important debates, worth having, worth struggling with, because cases like this one force us to confront uncomfortable truths about our society, our values, our willingness to help the most vulnerable among us. Aileen Wuornos was an extreme case, an outlier, someone whose combination of trauma and pathology and circumstances led her to commit terrible crimes. Most people who suffer childhood abuse don't become serial killers. Most homeless people don't murder strangers. Most sex workers don't kill their clients. Aileen was not representative of these groups, and we shouldn't use her case to make sweeping generalizations. But her case does illustrate what can happen when every system designed to protect vulnerable people fails. When a child is abused and no one intervenes. When a teenager is homeless and no one helps. When an adult is trapped in a cycle of addiction and survival crime and no one offers a way out. The failures accumulated, each one making the next more likely, until violence became inevitable. Could it have been prevented? Yes, at many points along the way. Should Aileen still be held responsible for her choices? Also yes. These two truths coexist. Conclusion. On the morning of October 9, 2002, Aileen Carol Wuornos was executed by the state of Florida for the murders of 7 men. She died at 56 years old, having spent 10 years on death row, having lived a life marked by more pain and violence than most people can imagine. Her death brought an end to one of the most unusual cases in American criminal history. A female serial killer who hunted male strangers along highways, who claimed self-defense while prosecutors claimed cold-blooded murder, whose traumatic past raised questions about culpability and redemption that remain unanswered. But her death didn't bring back the 7 men she killed. It didn't heal their family's grief. It didn't resolve the questions her case raised about justice and mercy and the nature of evil. It simply ended her story, leaving the rest of us to make sense of what happened and why. Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskaddon, Peter Siems, Troy Burress, Dick Humphreys, and Walter Antonio. 7 names, 7 lives. 7 families left to grieve. They were not statistics, not symbols, not representatives of anything other than themselves. They were human beings who deserved to live, who deserved to grow old, who deserved to be remembered with love and respect. Aileen Wuornos was also a human being, a damaged, violent, tragic human being who became a killer but who started as a victim. Her life was marked by abuse from the very beginning, and she never found a way out of the darkness that had been there since childhood. Should we feel sympathy for her? Should we feel anger? Should we feel both? There's no single right answer to these questions. Each person who learns about this case will draw their own conclusions based on their own values and experiences. Some will see Aileen as a victim who fought back and was punished for it. Others will see her as a predator who deserved her fate. Still others will see something more complicated, a person who was both victim and victimizer, who suffered terribly and caused terrible suffering in turn. What we should all agree on is that cases like this one are tragedies from beginning to end. Tragic that a child was abused and neglected. Tragic that she fell into prostitution and addiction. Tragic that she killed 7 people. Tragic that those 7 people died afraid and alone. Tragic that the families were left to grieve. Tragic that the only resolution the legal system could offer was more death. We should also agree that we can do better. We can create systems that intervene when children are being abused. We can provide resources for homeless youth before they turn to prostitution. We can offer treatment for addiction and mental illness.